A few years ago, my boss, a colleague, his dog, and I went on what was supposed to be a standard hunting and camping trip in the California desert. The plan was simple: survival camping. We would only carry water, food for the dog, and some emergency rations. Our firearms were supposed to ensure our safety, and we had communication sets in case anything went wrong. At least that's how it was supposed to go. We rented a 4x4 truck and drove it deep into the desert, where civilization felt miles away, almost non-existent. The nearest town was a solid hour's drive away, and we hadn't seen another soul since we hit the dirt roads. The desert heat was intense. It was one of those dry, oppressive kinds of heat that felt like it drained every ounce of energy from you the moment you stepped outside the vehicle. Despite the discomfort, we kept going, setting up camp far from the road, deep into the heart of the desert. We weren't exactly familiar with this part of California, but we didn't think it mattered much. The plan was to stay out of sight, off the beaten path, and rough it for a while. On the first night, we set up the tents, gathered some firewood, and made sure everything was in place. The dog, a big, tough-looking shepherd, was already pacing nervously around camp. He kept looking off into the distance, ears perked up. At first, we thought it was just the heat getting to him, but after a while, we started to notice that he wasn't acting like he usually did. This was a dog that had been trained to handle wild situations, trained to deal with big game in the forest back home. But here, in the desert, something was off. The first day, we didn't catch anything. We spent hours hunting, scanning the dry terrain, but the only thing we saw were some scattered tracks and a few scorpions skittering across the ground. The desert wasn't exactly known for abundance, and our water supply was the only thing that kept us going. It was hard to ignore the fact that the heat was unbearable, making the entire experience feel even worse than it should have been. But we pushed through. After all, we were on a survival trip, and this was just part of the challenge. The second day came and went, and again we returned to camp empty-handed. The dog had gotten even more restless, and we were starting to feel the fatigue set in. It wasn't just the hunger, it was the heat, the constant dryness that made everything feel more exhausting than it really was. The desert wasn't friendly. It felt as if it were trying to suck the life out of us with every passing hour. But the real issue wasn't just that we weren't finding anything to hunt. It was the heat. It had a way of making everything feel distant, unreal, and a little terrifying. The desert had a kind of silent, oppressive weight that seemed to press down on you, as if the earth itself was closing in on us. As the second night fell, we set out for another hunt. This time, we ventured farther from camp, pushing ourselves more than we should have. We all carried firearms, something we hadn't used yet, but it felt good to have them, just in case. It was getting darker, and the air had a strange, quiet stillness that didn't sit right with me. The dog, usually calm, was now whining and pulling at his leash, eager to get away from something. That's when we saw it. Droppings. Mountain lion droppings, to be exact. We all knew the signs. I don't care how prepared you are, you don't ignore the presence of a big cat in a place like this. Could have been nothing, but the tracks and the droppings were fresh. No one said anything, but we all felt a certain tension, a tightening in our stomachs. We decided not to dwell on it. After all, we were armed. A mountain lion was dangerous, sure, but we had the firepower. It wasn't going to surprise us. We made our way back to camp, feeling the weight of the desert night pressing down on us. We hadn't caught anything again, and we were running low on energy. The last thing any of us wanted was to get caught in the middle of the night with nothing to eat but some stale crackers and a half-empty water bottle. But that's how things were turning out. When we returned to camp, we lit a fire, trying to ease the discomfort of the day. The dog didn't settle, though. He was staring off into the distance, hackles raised, eyes darting in the dark. The fire flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the sand. My boss, trying to act casual, mentioned that it was probably just the heat affecting the dog's senses. But I could see it in his face, he was nervous too. The heat and hunger had begun to wear on all of us, and the silence of the desert felt more and more oppressive. That night, it all changed. We were sitting around the fire, trying to relax, when my colleague suddenly froze. He was staring into the dark, his face pale. The dog had gone crazy. He was barking, growling, fur bristling like he was seeing something we couldn't. I followed his gaze, and at first, I didn't see anything. But then, two pairs of eyes. They were distant, far off, but they glowed in the dark. A predator's eyes watching us, unblinking. The moment I saw them, my heart dropped. My boss cursed under his breath, and we immediately grabbed the rifles. The dog was going wild, pulling on the leash, barking furiously, and we could hear it too. The low growl in the distance, just barely audible but unmistakable. It sounded too big to be anything but a mountain lion or something just as dangerous. We stood there, rifles in hand, staring at the eyes that never seemed to blink. They stayed there unmoving for what felt like hours. In reality, it was probably only about 10 minutes. The only sounds were the occasional snap of the fire and the dog's frantic barking. My colleague was holding his gun so tight that his knuckles were white, and even though we were all armed, I could see the fear in his eyes. None of us moved. We couldn't. We just waited. The eyes didn't approach. They stayed where they were, locked on us. Then, slowly, they started to move, slipping out of our view as they disappeared into the darkness. We didn't hear anything, no rustling, no sounds of it moving away. It just vanished into the desert night like a shadow. We didn't sleep that night. We packed up everything, no questions asked. My boss had us all on edge, and the last thing we wanted was to stick around and risk getting attacked. The dog was still barking and growling in the direction the eyes had disappeared, but there was no sign of anything. No animal, no predator, nothing. With one person on guard and the rest of us packing up as quickly as we could, we rushed to the truck. The air felt thick with tension as we loaded everything into the back. The dog was still uneasy, still looking over his shoulder like he expected something to jump out of the shadows. The desert was vast, but it felt like it was closing in on us, as if it had become hostile to our very presence. We got into the truck, locked the doors, and rolled up the windows, and not a moment too soon. As we drove away, I kept glancing back over my shoulder, expecting to see something following us, but nothing ever did. The desert was as still as it had been when we first arrived, and we never saw those eyes again. We never found out what it was, but we all agreed it had been a mountain lion, or at least it seemed like it. There was no real proof. Maybe we had all gotten delirious from the heat and hunger. Maybe it had been our minds playing tricks on us, but then again, why had the dog reacted like that? Why had it been so agitated? He wasn't just barking, he was scared. And dogs know when something isn't right. We've never talked about it much since. The whole trip had been a disaster, but that night left an impression none of us could shake. Every time I think about it, I can't help but wonder if we were just lucky to get away, or if something in the desert had really been watching us. Either way, we never went back. I don't think any of us ever would. I'll start by saying this: I don't believe in supernatural stuff. Never have, never will. Growing up, I was always the skeptical type. I didn't buy into any of the ghost stories, UFO sightings, or anything people claim to experience in the dark of night. I've always preferred the logic of things. There's an explanation for everything, right? Science, reason, the real world. That's how I saw it. Anyways, I was about 19 when this happened, and I've never been able to fully shake it off. It's been years, and yet, even now, when I'm alone in the woods or near an old tree, I get this sense of unease crawling up my spine. It's not a superstition or anything I've tried to rationalize. It's just a feeling that has lingered ever since. I used to go camping a lot with my buddy Nate. We didn't have much, but we were young, and we loved the freedom of being out in nature. My little car was pretty much the only vehicle I had, but it worked. We'd pack it up. Camping gear, fishing rods, a cooler, and some snacks, and head out to a spot by the river that we found years ago. It wasn't on any map. It was one of those places that you could only find if you were willing to drive for an hour, then hike a few miles in the middle of nowhere. And I mean nowhere. There wasn't a town for miles. The closest thing to civilization was a small gas station about 50 miles away, but we liked it that way. We'd gotten to the spot early that day, about 5 a.m., maybe a little earlier. The air was still cool, the kind of chilly morning that makes you feel alive. The river was calm, the perfect setting for fishing. We spent the whole day out there, fishing, talking, just enjoying the quiet. By the time evening rolled around, we were setting up camp. The sun had already started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the ground. That night, things started to get strange. It was just a regular camping trip, nothing out of the ordinary. But that night, it changed everything. I went to bed as usual in my tent, tucked into my sleeping bag. The fire outside had burned down to embers, and the world around us had grown eerily quiet. I don't know what it was, but I remember feeling an odd sense of unease even before I fell asleep. It wasn't like I was scared of anything in particular, but I had this heavy feeling hanging over me. I couldn't place it, but it was there. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just the darkness and the isolation. After all, I had camped out plenty of times, and I wasn't scared of the woods. But then I fell asleep, and that's when everything went sideways. In the dream, I was walking through a grove of trees. Felt familiar, but also completely foreign. The air was thick, heavy, as if the trees themselves were suffocating the space. And then I came upon a tree. It was massive, far taller than the others, and twisted in a way that didn't make sense. Its bark was black, charred almost, and there was a faint glow around it, like something was radiating from the inside. But it wasn't warmth. It was something colder, something more unnatural. I could feel the tree before I saw it. It was like an infection, a parasite. It made my skin crawl. There was something wrong about it, something that didn't belong. I had this overwhelming sense that if I got too close, I'd be pulled in, consumed. But I didn't have a choice. My feet were moving toward it, slow and deliberate, almost as if they were being guided by some unseen force. The air around it was thick, like a dry, burnt smell. The kind you get when you're near a building that's been abandoned for years, the smell of rot that hangs in the air long after everything has fallen apart. The closer I got, the worse it felt. My stomach twisted, and my chest tightened. My heart raced. I tried to stop, to turn away, but the tree's presence was overwhelming, suffocating. And then I felt it, the tendrils. They weren't visible, but I could feel them, reaching into my body, running through my veins, taking control. It was like the tree was infecting me, slowly, inescapably. I couldn't move, couldn't fight it. It was as if everything around me had ceased to exist, and all that mattered was that tree. I woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my limbs trembling. I lay there in the dark of my tent, listening to the sounds of the night, the wind rustling through the trees, the distant call of an owl. But all I could focus on was that damn tree. It stayed with me, that feeling of dread, of helplessness. The weight of it didn't fade with the dream. It lingered throughout the day. Even though I tried to act normal, Nate noticed something was off. He kept asking if I was all right, but I couldn't explain what had happened. How could I explain something that didn't make sense? The rest of the trip passed by uneventfully, but I never fully shook that feeling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that tree, standing there in the grove, its twisted bark radiating that evil presence. I could almost smell it again, that dry, burnt scent that clung to my skin. It didn't make sense. I knew it didn't make sense, but that feeling, it was real. A year passed before I thought about it again. I was walking along the edge of my uncle's property, up in the Texas Hill Country. It was a bright, sunny day, nothing unusual. I was just out for a walk, enjoying the quiet. The land up there is rugged and wild, a mix of brush, rocky hills, and scattered oaks. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, but then I caught a whiff of that smell. It hit me like a freight train, that same burnt, rotting scent, the one I'd smelled in the dream, the one that had haunted me ever since. It was like a switch flipped in my mind. In an instant, I was back in that grove, facing that tree. My stomach lurched, and my heart skipped a beat. I could feel the panic rising in me. It was as if that sensation of being infected, of being controlled, was rushing back. I turned, and standing right in front of me was an old oak tree. It had died years ago, maybe 10, maybe more. The trunk was hollow, the bark cracked and falling away in pieces. But it wasn't just any tree. It was the tree, the one from the dream. I froze. Every instinct in me screamed to get away, to run. The same sense of dread, the same helplessness flooded my chest. It was the tree. I had no doubt in my mind. The very thing that had caused all those emotions, all that fear, was standing right in front of me in the real world. And there was nothing I could do about it. I took a step back, then another. I didn't know what was going on, but I wasn't going to stand there and figure it out. I wasn't going to test my luck. I stayed as far away from that tree as I could, my eyes never leaving it until I reached the edge of the property. I didn't know why it was there, or why I had felt that same terrifying presence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. I didn't go near that tree again. Hell, I didn't go near any trees in that area for a long time. Even now, every time I'm in the woods or near an old tree, I get that feeling. It's not fear in the traditional sense, and it's not something I can explain logically. It's just wrong. A sense that something is off, that something I can't see or touch is out there, waiting. And no matter how much I try to reason it away, the feeling doesn't go away. I still don't believe in ghosts or any supernatural nonsense. But I also know there are things in this world that can't be explained. I learned that the hard way, and that tree, that feeling, I don't think I'll ever forget it. I recently decided to go winter camping at a nearby state park. It wasn't my first time camping, but it was my first time doing it during the winter. I'd always liked the idea of being out in nature during the colder months. Everything felt quieter, more still. The snow had fallen just enough to cover the ground, but not too much that it made hiking difficult. The park wasn't far from where I lived, only about a 45-minute drive. I figured it would be a nice little solo getaway, a way to clear my head and disconnect for a bit. I arrived just before sunset, grabbed my gear, and started my hike toward my campsite. The park had a few established trails that led off into the woods, and I'd found a spot online that seemed perfect. It was a secluded area near a small pond, tucked away behind a patch of trees. There were some other campsites nearby, but they were all a little further off the main trail. My site was only about 200 yards away from the park road, though the trees and the pond would obscure it from view. The hike was easy enough, the only challenge being the cold and the occasional gust of wind that made me pull my jacket tighter. I reached my site just as the last bit of daylight was fading, and I quickly set up my tent. It was a simple two-person tent, nothing fancy, but reliable. I made sure to set up my fire pit a few feet away, not that I expected to use it much in the winter, but it was good to have it just in case. Once my tent was set up, I unpacked my gear, gathered some firewood, and started to get the fire going. As the fire crackled and the warmth from the flames spread, I began to settle in. The woods around me were silent, except for the occasional rustling of the trees in the wind and the soft sounds of the pond. There was something oddly peaceful about it all, and I felt my body begin to relax, the tension from work and everyday life starting to melt away. I cooked a simple meal, cleaned up, and by the time I finished, the sun had completely set. The only light was from the fire and the dim glow of my lantern. I wasn't planning on staying up too late. The cold had already started to creep in, and I figured I'd get some rest. I lay down in my sleeping bag, zipping it up tight to keep warm, and let the sounds of the night lull me to sleep. But as I started to drift off, I heard something. Footsteps, faint but clear. At first, I thought it was just an animal moving through the trees, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I didn't think much of it. But then I heard something else. A beam of light flickering across the woods, the kind of light you'd see from a flashlight. It wasn't like the gentle flicker of a campfire or the steady glow of a lantern. It was quick, purposeful, like someone was actively looking for something. I opened my eyes, straining to listen. The light swept across the far side of the pond, and I could just make out the shape of the trees, the shadows they cast on the snow. I held my breath, waiting, and then I saw it. The light swept toward my tent, and for a brief moment, I could see the glow shining through the thin fabric of my tent walls. It was followed by the sound of footsteps retreating, crunching softly in the snow as they moved away from my sight. Then, nothing. I sat up slowly, my heart beating a little faster than it had been a moment before. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Could have been another hiker, someone else looking for a place to camp, or maybe even a ranger making their rounds. The park did have rangers who would occasionally check on campers, and I had filed an itinerary with them earlier in the day, so they would know where I was. Still, something about it didn't sit right with me. Why had the person turned off the light when they saw my tent? Was I just being paranoid? I grabbed my knife from the side of my sleeping bag and kept it within reach. I figured I was just being overly cautious, but my instincts were on edge. I tried to push the thoughts aside, telling myself I was just tired and that the night was making me overthink things. I laid back down, pulling the blanket up around me, and tried to fall back asleep. But it wasn't long before I heard something else. A car. The sound was faint at first, like the crunching of tires on gravel, slowly growing louder as it approached. It took me a moment to realize what I was hearing, but then it became clear. Someone was driving down the trail toward my campsite. I froze, my mind racing. The only vehicles allowed on these trails were park vehicles or those with a permit, and it was the middle of winter. Why would anyone be driving out here? I could hear the vehicle getting closer, its tires crunching the gravel with each passing second. My eyes darted around the tent, but all I could see were the shadows of trees against the snow, the occasional flicker of light reflecting off the ice on the pond. Then, the headlights appeared, sweeping across the trees and onto the snow. The vehicle was coming right toward me. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath caught in my throat. I grabbed the knife, my fingers tight around the handle, and whispered a quiet hello into the dark. The sound of my voice felt strange in the quiet of the night, as if it didn't belong. The headlights didn't stop. Instead, they swung around the bend in the trail, directly shining on my tent. For a moment, everything was still. I held my breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, the vehicle's lights flicked off, and the sound of the engine started to fade as it backed up. The tires crunched again, this time retreating up the trail, away from my sight. I sat there in the dark, my mind racing. What the hell had just happened? Why had someone been driving out here in the middle of nowhere? And why had they backed away when I called out? I didn't know, but I had a bad feeling about it. I pulled my gear closer to me, keeping my knife within reach, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. After a few minutes, I decided to call the park office. Thankfully, I had a bit of signal on my phone, and I dialed the number. I didn't get an answer. I tried again, but still nothing. Feeling increasingly uneasy, I dialed 911. I explained my situation, told them where I was, and asked if there was anything going on in the area. The dispatcher told me to hold on and placed me on hold. I could feel my hands trembling as I gripped the phone, my mind spinning. When the dispatcher came back on the line, her voice was steady, but she sounded a bit distant. "Officers are in the area, looking for someone," she said. I asked her if she could give me more details, anything that would help me understand what was going on. I wasn't scared of a missing hiker or even a potential suspect. I was just trying to make sense of the situation. I mentioned that I was a dispatcher myself, that I was experienced in tracking people and staying alert in situations like this. But she wouldn't tell me anything more. "Just stay put," she said, and I could hear the urgency in her voice. "We'll keep you updated." But no update came. I was left there, alone in the woods, with no idea who the officers were looking for or why they were in the area. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but I knew there was nothing I could do. I couldn't leave, it was too cold, too dark, and I had no idea what might be out there. Whoever had been driving down the trail was still a mystery to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the night on edge, my eyes never straying far from the shadows of the trees. Every small noise made me jump. Every rustle in the wind felt like someone was nearby, watching. But as the night wore on, nothing else happened. The vehicle didn't come back. No more lights flashed through the trees. Just the cold, the silence, and the eerie feeling of being watched. By morning, I packed up my gear in a hurry. I wasn't going to stay another night. Whatever had happened, whatever had been going on in the woods, I didn't want to find out. As I made my way back down the trail toward the parking area, I didn't see anyone else on the path, and I didn't see any signs of the officers who'd been in the area. It was like the whole thing had never happened. But I knew it had. The footsteps, the lights, the vehicle, none of it made sense. And I wasn't sure I ever wanted to camp alone in the winter again. The first mistake we made was arriving after dark. We had been planning the trip for weeks, a group of friends looking to escape the noise and chaos of the city. None of us had ever been camping before, but the idea of spending a weekend in nature seemed like the perfect getaway. The campground was a couple of hours out of town, nestled deep in the woods, a place none of us had ever visited. We didn't do much research, thinking we could figure things out when we got there. The plan was simple: set up the tent, build a fire, and enjoy the peace and quiet. But by the time we arrived, the sun was long gone, and the moon was barely peeking through the trees. The only light came from the faint glow of our headlights as we pulled into the campground. There was an eerie quiet, the kind that settles over a place when the last rays of the sun are swallowed by the horizon, leaving only the silence behind. We didn't know what to expect, but we assumed there would be other campers. We had no idea how many, but from the looks of the empty parking lot, it seemed like we had the place to ourselves, or so we thought. As we drove along the gravel path, our headlights swept over rows of empty sites, most of which were already taken. But there was one far off in the back, isolated and tucked away from the others. Felt like the perfect spot. "We'll be far from everyone else," I said, as I pointed toward the site. "We'll have peace and quiet, no one to bother us." One of my friends agreed, already unbuckling his seatbelt. We pulled into the site, turned off the engine, and opened the doors to the cool, crisp night air. It was unsettlingly quiet. No sounds of crickets, no wind rustling through the trees. Just silence. I could feel the weight of the night pressing in on us. We were excited, despite the odd feeling creeping up my spine. The site was clear, just a patch of grass surrounded by thick trees. It was far enough away from the other campers that we wouldn't have to hear them. I couldn't help but wonder why the place felt so isolated. Maybe the other campers knew something we didn't, but I brushed the thought aside. We were here to have fun. We set up the tent quickly, laughing and joking as we worked. There was something oddly comforting about being in the wilderness, away from everything. We couldn't hear the city anymore. No sirens, no chatter, just the sound of our voices and the rustling of the tent fabric as we pitched it into place. Once the tent was up, we gathered around the campfire. The crackling of the fire was a welcome sound, and it made everything feel warmer, cozier. We roasted marshmallows, told stories, and drank from the coolers we brought. As the firelight flickered and danced, the shadows around us seemed to stretch further into the trees. After a while, we decided it was time to turn in. We had a long day ahead of us, and we were all exhausted. The fire slowly died down, leaving behind only a few glowing embers. One by one, we climbed into the tent, slipping into our sleeping bags. The night was cold, but I didn't mind it. I was too tired to care. I was just starting to drift off, the warmth of the sleeping bag making me feel heavy, my thoughts hazy. But then, in the distance, I heard something. At first, it was faint, just a low rumble, like the growl of thunder far off on the horizon. It didn't seem too strange at first. The weather had been unpredictable earlier in the day. Maybe it was a storm rolling in. But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder. I shifted uncomfortably, listening. It wasn't thunder. The sound was getting closer, and it was unmistakable now, a rhythmic, deep rumbling. It was the sound of something big, something powerful. A train. My friends didn't seem to notice at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The sound was building, getting louder and louder, until it felt like the earth was shaking beneath me. I could feel the vibrations in my chest, as if the sound was traveling directly through me. The air seemed to hum with the approaching noise, and my body tensed, my heart racing. The train had to be miles away, but it sounded as though it were right next to us. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the deafening rumble, but it only intensified. The noise rose in pitch, almost overwhelming in its volume. Suddenly, the sound cut through the night like a blaring horn. A single bright light pierced the darkness outside the tent, casting sharp shadows across the walls. The light illuminated everything in its path, and for a split second, it felt like we were about to be hit by something huge, something unstoppable. I froze, my mind racing. What was happening? Why was the train so loud? My thoughts were interrupted by a blinding flash of light, so bright that it felt like the entire world had been lit up. The light from the train's headlamp bathed the inside of the tent in an unnatural glow, making the walls of the tent glow like a pale white sheet. The moment I saw that light, fear surged through me. I grabbed my friend's arm, shaking him awake. "Get out! Now!" There wasn't time to think, only to act. The sound of the train was deafening now, filling the entire air, vibrating in the ground beneath me. The headlight cast a harsh shadow against the inside of the tent, and for a split second, I felt like I was staring directly into the face of something terrifying, something unstoppable. I scrambled to unzip the tent, my fingers fumbling with the zipper. Panic surged through me, and the world seemed to narrow down to that single urgent need to escape. My friends were already scrambling to their feet, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. I flung the tent door open, and we stumbled outside into the cold night. The moment we did, the deafening sound of the train overwhelmed us, a massive rush of noise. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked up, my breath coming in short gasps. And there it was. The train was barreling toward us, its massive form racing past the campsite, the headlights glaring as it rushed by with a force I couldn't comprehend. It was so close, I could feel the air being sucked into its path as it thundered past. The ground shook beneath me, the noise so intense I couldn't think straight. We had set up our tent barely 10 feet from the railroad tracks. My heart was still racing as the train passed, the roar of it slowly fading into the night. I stood frozen, staring at the train, which seemed to stretch on forever. The light from the train's headlamp still burned in my eyes, even though it had already passed. For what felt like an eternity, none of us spoke. We just stood there, watching as the train rumbled off into the distance. Finally, when it was nothing more than a fading sound in the night, I collapsed to the ground, my legs weak with adrenaline. We hadn't seen the tracks when we set up the tent. They had been hidden in the dark, and in our excitement, we hadn't noticed the warning signs, if there even were any. We had no idea there was a train route that close to the campsite. None of us said anything for a long time. We were all too shaken to speak, the reality of what could have happened still sinking in. It wasn't just the shock of the near miss, it was the terror of how close we had come to disaster. The night stretched on, but we didn't go back to the tent. We couldn't. Instead, we huddled together in a tight group, too afraid to go near the place where we had just been. The train had passed, but the fear lingered. We stayed awake, talking quietly, too afraid to sleep. In the end, we didn't even bother to stay for the full weekend. None of us felt safe there anymore. We packed up our things and left in the morning, the campfire still smoking in the distance. We never spoke of the incident again, but we all knew the truth. We had been lucky, and sometimes luck doesn't come around twice. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. The Boundary Waters in Minnesota, remote, vast, and wild, was exactly what I needed. My friends and I had done plenty of camping before, but this time, I wanted something different, something more raw.
No tent.
Just me and my hammock. Felt like a good decision at the time. The hammock seemed perfect for the experience. Lightweight, compact, and ideally suited for those nights when you just wanted to be out there, closer to the wilderness. I draped a tarp over it for some protection from the rain, but I figured I could deal with a little exposure. I didn't mind the idea of feeling the wind against my face, hearing the sounds of the forest all around me, but I hadn't really thought about how vulnerable it would make me feel. That night, everything seemed calm when I first settled in. The sun was slipping away, and the lake below shimmered softly in the last light. The sound of the waves gently lapping against the shore was soothing. I could hear my friends in their tents, the occasional rustling of sleeping bags as they got comfortable for the night. But as soon as darkness settled fully, things started to change. The sky, which had been clear all day, began to fill with dark clouds. A storm was coming in. I knew it, felt it in my bones. The air had gotten thick, heavy with moisture. I could hear distant rumbles of thunder. It was going to be one of those storms that hit hard and fast. I told myself I'd be fine, that I was ready for this. The hammock felt secure. The tarp was well fastened, and I had my sleeping bag. What else could I need? But then, as the wind began to pick up, I realized just how exposed I really was. The hammock swayed a little more than I liked, and I tried to adjust it to be more stable, but there was only so much I could do. It's a strange feeling, being out in the open like that. The lack of walls around you, the lack of any real cover. It makes you feel incredibly small. It's one thing to be surrounded by trees, the thick forest giving you a sense of privacy. But it's another when you're lying in a little hammock with nothing but the sky above you and the wilderness all around. Then the storm really hit. The first bolt of lightning tore across the sky, brighter than anything I'd ever seen, and I jumped, heart racing. The thunder cracked so loudly that I thought it might tear the world apart. Rain started pouring, heavy and relentless, beating down on my tarp. I was secure for the most part, but the storm's fury was something else. I felt like I was at the mercy of nature, at the mercy of everything out there. I tried to close my eyes, but it was impossible. The wind howled, the trees bent and creaked under the strain, and then the lightning would flash again, illuminating the world in a way that made it feel like I could see everything, even though the flashes were only brief. Couldn't sleep. I just lay there, my eyes wide open, staring at the dark shapes of trees that loomed around me. The wind whistled through the leaves, and the rain splashed against the ground below. But it wasn't the storm that kept me awake. It was the feeling of something out there. It started with a flicker, a silhouette moving across the edge of my vision. The flash of lightning revealed it for just a second. It was dark, too dark to make out clearly, but it looked like something large, something fast. The shape of a wolf? Maybe. It wasn't clear. Could have been a trick of the light. I had no idea. But then it happened again. Another flash of lightning, and I saw it again. This time it was closer. The shape, definitely something moving fast through the trees, was unmistakable. The silhouette of a wolf, or maybe more than one. I froze, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but I couldn't deny what I was seeing. The wolves, they were moving along the edge of the trees, just at the limit of the light. But every time the lightning flashed, they seemed closer and closer. It was one of those moments where your brain just can't make sense of what's happening. You see it, but it doesn't quite add up. The lightning made the world blink in and out of existence. Each time the sky lit up, the world went from dark to blindingly bright, and then back to blackness again, leaving my eyes scrambling to adjust. The wolves, if that's what they were definitely getting closer. The lightning illuminated the hillside, the lake below, the trees in between. For a second, I thought I saw the flash of eyes, reflecting the light like the glow of amber. But the next moment, it was gone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I wasn't sure how many there were, but the silhouettes seemed to move in a pattern, moving toward me, circling, getting closer. The thought that I was being watched was the most unnerving thing. My thoughts were racing, my mind struggling to rationalize it. Were they just passing through? Was I imagining things? Or was something actually out there, moving in the dark, closing in on me? Couldn't move, couldn't look away. Another flash of lightning. The silhouettes were gone again, just as quickly as they had appeared. I couldn't see anything now, but the air was thick with tension. My heart was hammering in my chest. I could hear the storm, feel it, but the silence from the forest around me was deafening. That's when I really felt it, the vulnerability. In a tent, you're shielded from the world. You have walls, even if they're thin and flimsy. You can't see the things that move in the dark, and maybe that's what gives you peace. But here, in the open, I felt like prey. Like something could crawl up to me from the forest and I wouldn't see it coming. I was just lying there, trapped in my hammock, with nothing between me and whatever might be lurking out there in the woods. I told myself it was probably just a few wolves, that they'd move on once the storm passed. But the thought of being exposed, of not knowing what was out there, was too much. Every time the lightning lit up the sky, I scanned the forest, hoping to catch sight of whatever was moving around out there. But all I saw were shadows, nothing more. And then, in the brief moments of darkness, I could hear the sounds of the forest. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional growl or bark. Every sound felt amplified, like the world had been turned up to full volume. The storm raged on, and with each passing second, I felt more and more like something was about to happen, something that would tear the world apart. But then, after what felt like an eternity, the storm started to die down. The wind calmed, the rain lightened to a drizzle. The flashes of lightning became fewer and farther apart. The last distant rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. And then, all at once, the forest went quiet. The wolves, if they had ever been there, were gone. The feeling of being watched, of being exposed, slowly faded away, and I allowed myself to breathe again. I didn't know if I'd seen anything real that night. Maybe it had just been the storm messing with my senses. Maybe the shadows had played tricks on my eyes. But it didn't matter. I didn't get any sleep that night. Not much anyway. My heart never stopped pounding in my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about how close those wolves had seemed, how vulnerable I had felt, out there in the open, with nothing but the tarp above me. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the trees, I got up and packed my things. My friends were still asleep in their tents, blissfully unaware of what I had experienced. They would never know how close I had come to something I couldn't explain. I wasn't sure I could even explain it to myself. But that morning, as I looked out over the lake, calm once again under the rising sun, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd learned something about the wilderness that night. It's beautiful, it's peaceful, but it's also wild and unpredictable, and in moments like that, you're not always as safe as you think you are. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit of security, a wall between you and the dark, isn't such a bad thing after all. It was about 4 years ago when I found myself deep in the wilds of northern British Columbia, Canada, for an army training exercise. The kind of place where the trees seem to swallow you whole, and the dense, damp air clings to your skin. The camp was set up just as the summer was beginning to transition into fall, so there was still warmth in the air, but the nights carried a chill that seeped in once the sun dipped below the treeline. The exercise was supposed to be a joint training operation between the Canadian forces and some American troops. The idea was to familiarize us with the terrain, practice tactical maneuvers, and ensure we could work together in case we ever had to do it for real. I didn't mind it much. We were doing what we signed up for. Training is part of the job, after all. But that night, things felt off. During the day, the exercises went as expected. We worked through mock attacks, ambushes, and small unit tactics. The Americans had their own training objectives at their camp, a couple of kilometers away. Our two groups kept mostly to ourselves but met up occasionally for joint drills. By dusk, the day was wrapping up, and the camp began to settle into that peculiar quiet that only happens when people are exhausted and too tired to make noise. We set up our bivouac site just like we'd done hundreds of times before. Tents went up with practiced ease, and everyone started to wind down. Our job as soldiers is always to stay alert, though, and that means someone has to keep watch while the others sleep. It's not glamorous. Just sitting there, keeping your eyes on the shadows and listening to the night. But it's necessary. This time, I got stuck with the 2 a.m. to 3:30 a.m. shift. I wasn't thrilled about it, but that's how it goes. I wasn't alone, of course. My fire team partner was on watch with me. He wasn't thrilled about the timing either, but he didn't complain. We sat by the fire that was still burning low, a few embers flickering in the center of camp. The night was cool but not unbearable, and the dark was dense with the weight of the forest around us. The trees seemed to rise endlessly, their shapes shifting in the gloom. To anyone who hasn't experienced it, that kind of isolation can mess with your head, even without something to be afraid of. The first half of the shift was uneventful. Just the usual sounds, the crackle of the fire, the faint rustle of leaves, and the occasional chirp of crickets. But at some point, I started to feel it. The air shifted. You know that feeling when you step into a room and something feels off but you can't pinpoint why? That's how it was. I couldn't hear the wind, which was strange. The forest should have been alive with the wind brushing through the trees, but it wasn't. Everything felt muffled, like when you wake up to fresh snow and the world feels wrapped in a blanket. But there was no snow. It was mid-August. It didn't make sense. My partner was a few paces away from me, keeping his watch in his own little corner of the biv site, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that it was just my mind playing tricks after a long day of training. But the feeling only got worse. My stomach twisted, and I could feel my body tensing up. It was like I wasn't alone anymore, but no one had moved into camp. I was just aware of something lurking beyond the light of the fire. And then I heard it. At first, it was so quiet I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. A faint whispering, barely audible over the sound of my breathing. It was coming from the trees, but I couldn't tell how far off it was. It sounded close, though, too close. I strained my ears, trying to make out what was being said, but the words were muffled, indistinct, almost as if they were being carried by the wind, but there was no wind. I froze. I wanted to turn my head and glance around, but I didn't. It's like the moment you realize you're in a dangerous situation, your instincts kick in, and you know the best thing to do is stay still and quiet. My fingers instinctively curled around the rifle I had slung over my shoulder, even though it was unloaded. The feel of the cold metal in my hands was oddly comforting. I wanted to shine my flashlight into the trees to see what was making the noise, but I didn't. Not yet. I knew that the second I shone the light, I'd either reveal myself to whoever was out there or make it worse by drawing attention. But that whispering, it didn't stop. It went on for what felt like forever, winding its way through the trees, never quite forming into something I could understand. After a few more seconds, I couldn't stand it any longer. I slowly pulled out my flashlight, turning the dial as quietly as I could, and aimed it into the dark. Nothing. The beam of light sliced through the blackness, but there was nothing there. No movement, no shadow, no shape. I shone it on the trees, the ground, the empty space in between, but it was as if the whispering had never happened. I waited for a few seconds, trying to calm myself. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just some sound that my brain had twisted into something sinister. I glanced over to my fire team partner, who had noticed the light. He was walking toward me now, his steps deliberate and quiet. "Everything good?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, but I could tell from his expression that he wasn't convinced. He had that look in his eyes, the one that says he's been feeling the same thing you have, but he doesn't want to say it out loud. "Did you hear anything?" I asked. He shook his head, but I could tell from the way he looked around, scanning the trees, that he had felt the same unease. He hadn't heard the whispering, though. He hadn't heard anything, and that made me feel more alone. I wanted to tell him about it, about what I had heard, but I didn't. He didn't hear it, so it was easy to chalk it up to my imagination. Maybe it was just the isolation, the stress from training, playing tricks on me. We sat in silence for a few more minutes, trying to keep the mood light. But the quiet was different now. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was thick with tension, heavy with the unspoken things we didn't want to acknowledge. Eventually, the whispering didn't return, and I began to think it really was nothing. Just the woods playing tricks on me. By the time the shift ended, nothing else had happened. No more whispers, no more odd feelings. The fire team rotated, and I stumbled into my tent, exhausted and unsettled. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the feeling of being watched crept back into my thoughts. In the morning, I brushed it off. We had more training to do, and the day was full of tasks and drills. I didn't want to dwell on it, but as we packed up and got ready to move, I couldn't help but feel a nagging curiosity about the whispering. I didn't think it was the Americans, they were too far away, and I didn't hear anything coming from their direction. Besides, the way the whispers had sounded, it was almost like they were coming from the trees themselves. Later that day, we met up with the Americans again. We joked and exchanged stories about the training, but I never mentioned the incident. They seemed normal, like nothing strange had happened. The next night, we all camped in the same general area, keeping the same routine. But this time, I wasn't on watch. My shift was over, and I was finally able to get some rest. But I kept thinking about it. The whispering, the strange silence before it, and that feeling that something had been watching me from the darkness. I didn't tell anyone about it. In fact, I didn't really tell anyone anything for a long time. It wasn't that I didn't trust them, but there was something about that night, about the weirdness of it all, that made me keep it to myself. Years have passed since then, and I still think about that night. It wasn't some ghost story or supernatural phenomenon. It was just strange, real and strange. Something that, at the time, felt like a prank or a bad trick of the mind. But now, as I look back, I wonder if it was something more. Something that I'll never be able to explain. I've done a lot of camping over the years. It's been an escape for me, a place to clear my head and find peace in the quiet of the woods. But let me tell you, not every trip ends in peace. Some of the stories from my experiences still give me chills, and I'm not talking about the kind that comes from a cold breeze at night. I'm talking about real, raw fear that sticks with you even when you've made it home. I was on a trail in central Pennsylvania, one of my regular haunts, when it happened. I was hiking with a buddy of mine. We'd been out there for a few days, the trail winding through the trees and the occasional clearing. The sun had just begun to dip behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the path. We were making our way back to camp when we saw him. A man, standing in the middle of the trail. He wasn't far from us, maybe 30 yards. But as soon as I laid eyes on him, something felt off. The man was holding an axe. Not like he was using it to chop wood, but like he was holding it in a defensive posture, arms out, axe raised. It wasn't like he was ready to swing, but more like he was waiting for something. His stance was rigid, and the look on his face was stone cold. His eyes didn't seem to blink. It was eerie. We said hello, like you do to anyone out in the woods, just trying to make contact, but he didn't respond. Not a nod, not a smile, nothing. He just kept staring at us, gripping that axe. It was like he was waiting for us to make the next move. My buddy and I exchanged a glance, both of us unsure what to do. We tried to keep walking casually, keeping our distance, but as we took a few steps forward, he turned his head to follow us. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. We made our way past him, trying to act normal, but I could feel his eyes on us the whole time. Even when we were almost out of sight, I could feel that gaze, sharp and unblinking. We didn't speak another word to each other until we were a good distance away, and then we just kept moving, trying to shake off that feeling. It wasn't until we got back to camp that I realized how strange it was that he hadn't said a word. Maybe I'd been around the woods too much, but that guy just didn't sit right with me. I wasn't worried about him coming after us. He'd had his chance, right? But I couldn't stop thinking about how he just stood there, that axe still held in his hands, like he was waiting for something. That was just the start, though. I've had my fair share of run-ins with wildlife, but there's one story from my late teens that still makes my stomach turn every time I think about it. It was a group trip, about 10 of us. We decided to head deep into the woods, far from any established campsites, far from any kind of civilization. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun, drinking, and a little peace. We didn't know it was going to turn into a nightmare. We were all packed, the campsite set up, and the drinks were flowing. It didn't take long before the group was drunk, maybe too drunk. The fire was burning low, and the night was filled with laughter and stories. But none of us paid attention to the sounds of the forest, the animals, the trees, the night. We were too busy in our own world to notice the danger around us. What we didn't know, what none of us thought about, was that we weren't the only ones feasting that night. We had hung our food packs high up in the trees, a typical safety precaution against the local raccoons and other scavengers. They were hung about 25 feet off the ground, far enough that even the best climbers would have a hard time getting to them. But we were wrong, dead wrong. We woke up the next morning to find our packs had been ransacked. The bags were hanging down low, shredded in places, with huge gashes torn into the plastic containers. First, we thought it was just raccoons. But when we got a closer look, it was clear that the teeth marks were far too large for any raccoon. It looked like something bigger, something stronger. That's when we heard the rangers. They confirmed that we'd had an unwelcome visitor, Sasha, a local mama bear, and her cubs. They'd been in the area, and they weren't afraid to get close to campsites if food was available. It was terrifying. We had been so out of it, so drunk. None of us had heard the bear come through. None of us had heard the rustling of the trees, the snapping of branches, or the heavy footsteps of a bear. And what's worse, the bear had taken one of our food packs. It was gone, never to be found again. The rangers told us that it was likely we weren't the first ones that Sasha had visited. Apparently, this wasn't the first time she'd gotten into human food in that area, and with cubs to feed, she'd been more aggressive. But hearing that didn't make me feel any better. The fact that none of us heard the bear, that we were so oblivious, is what still makes my stomach churn. We had no idea what could have happened if we'd been awake when she came through. It was a good thing we didn't find out. We were lucky. The bear could have easily turned on us if it had felt threatened. Instead, she just wanted food, and once she got what she needed, she was gone. But that doesn't change the fact that we were in her territory, completely unprepared for the real dangers of the woods. We got away with it, but not everyone is so lucky. There was one other trip that sticks with me, a canoe trip, a lot of the same people I had gone camping with. We decided to take a spring trip down a river, a peaceful float through the wilds. The water was high because of snowmelt, and the current was stronger than usual, but we thought we could handle it. The trip was supposed to be simple, just a few days on the river, but the water was moving faster than we expected. We came up on a bridge, one of those old wooden ones, barely wide enough for two canoes to pass under at the same time. The river was swollen, so there was barely a foot of clearance between the top of our canoes and the bridge. I'll never forget the feeling of the current pushing against us as we tried to ease under the bridge. You had to back paddle hard just to keep from tipping. The water was swift, and if you weren't careful, you'd be caught and flipped. It was close, so close. As we finally made it under the bridge, I saw something in the distance. Other people in boats. They were waving at us, shouting something. We couldn't hear them clearly, but their mouths were moving fast. They were pointing at us, and we couldn't understand why. That's when we heard what they were yelling, "Life jackets! You need life jackets!" It was then that we realized something terrible. Another group of canoeists had come down the same stretch of river earlier, and they hadn't made it through. The current had taken them, and they tipped. One of them was missing, presumed drowned. My parents heard about it later that day and thought it was me or someone from my group. They actually sent someone to find out if we were all right. We got lucky. We made it through. But it was a stark reminder that the river wasn't just a relaxing flow of water. It had the power to kill. And it would have too if we hadn't been so careful, so vigilant. But even then, the fact that someone else hadn't been so lucky haunted me. It made me realize just how fragile we are when it comes to nature. In the end, that's what I've learned about camping. It's a beautiful thing, the wilderness, but it's not kind. You can't expect it to be. Sometimes nature doesn't care about you. Sometimes it's just about survival, and if you don't respect it, you're not going to make it. So yeah, those are my stories. They might sound like small things, but when you're out there, alone in the woods with only your wits and a couple of friends to rely on, those little things start to feel much bigger. We didn't die, we didn't get hurt, but we came close. And that's enough to make me think twice the next time I head into the woods. Because I know now, things out there aren't always what they seem. Sometimes the woods aren't so quiet, and sometimes the people you meet aren't as friendly as they first appear. It was supposed to be another one of those fun weekend camping trips. My friend, Mark, and I had been hiking around the same valley for months, always finding new spots to explore during the day. It was a beautiful area. Lush trees, quiet streams, and rugged hills that seemed to stretch endlessly. But this time, we wanted to do something a little different. We decided to camp overnight by the old, abandoned cabin that sat nestled between two towering pine trees. We'd seen the cabin several times during our hikes, but we had never actually spent the night there. I'm not sure why, but something about that place always felt off. The cabin was run down, the wooden walls weathered with years of neglect. There were no windows, just openings where the glass had long since shattered. It didn't look like anyone had been there in decades, but there was still something strange about it, something unsettling. But we were adventurous and curious. The thought of camping near an old cabin, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves, sounded perfect. Plus, Mark and I both had a love for the outdoors, and I had my dog with me. Maggie, a large, protective mutt who had been my companion for years. She'd always been fearless, the kind of dog who wasn't afraid of anything, not even the deepest woods or the darkest corners of the forest. We set up camp a little ways from the cabin. The sun was starting to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the valley. The air was growing cooler, the sounds of the forest becoming more pronounced as the light faded. Mark and I worked quickly, setting up the tent, gathering firewood, and starting a small campfire. Maggie, as usual, sniffed around the area, keeping an eye on everything, but she didn't seem too concerned about the cabin. Once we were settled in, we cooked dinner over the fire, simple stuff, just some pasta and sausage. We ate quietly, listening to the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Mark and I talked about old hiking trips, shared stories, and laughed, but I couldn't help but glance over at the cabin every now and then. It just looked so out of place in the middle of the valley, like it didn't belong. After a while, we cleaned up and crawled into the tent. Maggie curled up next to me, lying on her side, content to rest after the day's hike. I was still thinking about the cabin, but I tried to push it out of my mind. It wasn't anything unusual. It was just an old, abandoned building. I had to remind myself that there was no reason to be spooked. An hour passed, and the night settled in around us. The sky was completely dark now, the stars scattered across the black expanse like tiny diamonds. The fire had long since burned out, leaving only the soft glow of the embers behind. Everything was quiet, almost too quiet. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, coming from just outside the tent. It was soft at first, like a twig snapping, followed by a faint shuffle. I froze, straining to listen. My heart skipped a beat. It sounded like someone, or something, was moving around just outside. Mark must have heard it too, because he sat up suddenly. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. His voice was low, tense. I nodded slowly, trying to calm myself. Maggie, however, wasn't so calm. She was already on her feet, her body tense, ears perked, her hackles raised, and she let out a low growl, something I'd never heard from her before. Maggie was never afraid of anything. She had been with me on countless trips, and nothing ever made her react like this. The growl continued for a few seconds, then stopped abruptly. But Maggie didn't settle down. She paced around the inside of the tent, her paws scraping softly against the fabric as she circled us. Her eyes were wide, scanning the darkness outside. The low growl continued intermittently, a quiet but constant warning that something wasn't right. Mark and I exchanged a look, both of us trying to make sense of what was happening. We could still hear the faint rustling from outside, but it wasn't consistent. It came in bursts, as if someone or something was moving around and then stopping, listening, waiting. "Maybe it's just an animal," Mark said. though I could tell by his voice that he didn't believe it. The rustling sounded too deliberate, too cautious. I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what it was, but my gut told me that whatever was outside wasn't just an animal. I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. Maggie's pacing didn't help. She was agitated now, moving back and forth, as if keeping a protective perimeter around us. Her growls were growing louder, and her body was rigid. I had never seen her act like this before. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Mark and I huddled in the center of the tent, trying to stay as quiet as possible, our breaths shallow. Maggie continued her patrol, moving in tight circles, keeping her eyes fixed on the entrance of the tent. She wasn't just on alert, she was ready to act. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe a deer or a raccoon, I thought. Maybe it was even another camper who had gotten lost. But none of that made sense. This was different. The air felt thick with tension, and the sounds outside were unnerving. The rustling had stopped now, but the feeling of being watched never left. I couldn't shake the sense that someone or something was out there, waiting. Hours passed like this. The sounds outside came and went, always stopping just before we could pinpoint what they were. Maggie continued her pacing, occasionally letting out a low growl, her eyes never leaving the entrance of the tent. Couldn't sleep. My mind raced, and every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was right on the other side of the fabric, watching us. At some point, I drifted off into a restless sleep. It wasn't a deep sleep, more like a half-sleep, where your mind is still aware of everything happening around you. I woke up suddenly, gasping for air. I didn't know what had caused it, but I was wide awake, heart pounding in my chest. The night was still dead quiet, the kind of silence that only comes when everything is watching. But something was different. The air had shifted, like the pressure had changed. I listened carefully. No rustling, no pacing, just the sound of my own breathing and the soft rustle of the trees in the wind. I looked over at Mark. He was still asleep, or at least he seemed to be. Maggie, though, was standing at attention, her nose pressed to the fabric of the tent. She let out a soft whine, almost like a warning. Then, before I could do anything, I heard it. A loud thump, followed by another, and another. It sounded like something was hitting the side of the cabin. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks, then silence. I don't know what happened after that. I don't know if I blacked out from fear or if I fell into a deep sleep. But when I woke up again, the sun was rising. The cabin looked unchanged, the valley still quiet and untouched. But the feeling from the night before lingered in the air. Something had happened, and I wasn't sure what it was. Maggie, who had been so alert during the night, was calm now. She lay beside me, her eyes soft and unfocused. Mark woke up shortly after I did. He didn't mention the events of the night, and I didn't either. We both knew something was wrong, but we didn't want to say it out loud. We packed up quickly, got our gear together, and left the valley behind without looking back. When we were far enough away, I couldn't stop myself from asking, "Did you hear it? The knocking?" Mark looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I heard it." We never went back to that cabin, and I've never been able to explain what happened that night. There are stories about abandoned places like that, stories about strange people who wander through the woods, but I've never been able to find anything about what we experienced. Whatever it was real, and I don't know if I ever want to find out the truth.